Hello, so we are going to debrief that exercise which consisted in a what-if analysis. You could call it also, for scenario 1 and scenario 2, a univariate sensitivity analysis, which consists in simulating the impact of a change in one parameter only when the scenario 3 is a multivariate scenario analysis where both price and volume change at the same time. So the first question which I asked in the questionnaire was the sales growth rate equals change in price plus change in volume. If we look at scenario 1 and if we look at scenario 2, if we look at change in sales, we see that yes, scenario 1 has a change in sales which equals the change in volume, and yes, the scenario 2 has a change in sales which equals the change in price. But as soon as you change both the price and the volume, you see that you can't sum up delta P and delta Q, because in that case you would get plus 10 when the change in sales equals plus 8. So the assertion was wrong. The second assertion is price and volume have an equivalent impact on the change in contribution margin. Look at scenario 1 and look at scenario 2. The scenario 1 generates a change in contribution margin by minus 10%, which equals the change in volume. But you see that the change in price by minus 10% for the scenario 2 generates a decrease in contribution margin by 50%. So an equivalent change in price and change in volume by minus 10% don't have the same impact on the contribution margin. Why? Many among you observed that when the volume decreases, both your sales and your variable cost decrease by 10%. When only the price varies, there is no change in variable cost, hence the impact on contribution margin is bigger. The third question was, when a company decreases its price, it's possible to maintain the contribution margin ratio if the volume increases enough. I think you mixed up, in some cases, the contribution margin in absolute value and the contribution margin ratio. Yes, if the volume increases enough, you can sometimes keep the same contribution margin in value if the price decreases. But if you observe the scenario 2 and the scenario 3, they have the same change in price by minus 10, but they have a different change in volume. However, the ending contribution margin ratio in both cases is 11.11%, which means the volume doesn't impact the ending contribution margin ratio. So you can't offset a price decrease with an increase in volume when considering the contribution margin ratio. In fact, a contribution margin ratio represents the unit contribution margin for 100 euros of sales. So it doesn't depend on volume. The fourth assertion was sales and profitability evolve in the same direction. It's only true for scenario 1 and scenario 2 when there's only one parameter changing. But when you look at scenario 3, it's an interesting situation of what I call an operating divergence, where the sales go up and the contribution margin goes down, which you could call an unprofitable growth, or, if you prefer, working more in order to earn less. The fifth assertion was there is a constant proportionality between the change in contribution margin and the change in operating income. That was true because the fixed costs don't change. If you look at this row, there were no change in fixed costs. In that case, you see that in value, the change in EBIT will be the same as the change in contribution margin, which is logical, but because the EBIT due to fixed cost is less than the contribution margin, in percentage, the change in EBIT will be bigger than the change in contribution margin. Precisely, if you look at the row number 18, you see that the change in EBIT is the change in contribution margin multiplied by 1.6. That 1.6 is the DOL. The DOL is the degree of operating leverage. It's a concept that we are going to study during the course. You see that the DOL was calculated here. You calculate it by dividing the contribution margin ratio over the EBIT. So we're almost through. The last assertion was when a company decreases its unit fixed cost by spreading the fixed cost over a larger number of units, its profitability goes up. If you look at scenario 3, there is a decrease in unit fixed cost due to the fact that the total fixed costs are fixed and there is an increase in volume. Hence, the fixed cost per unit goes down. However, you see that in spite of those fixed costs per unit going down, the contribution margin decreases and the EBIT as well. In fact, because total fixed costs are fixed, the change in EBIT can only come from a change in contribution margin. The movement of unit fixed cost is irrelevant in order to explain the movement of profitability. The profitability changes when the contribution margin increases with fixed cost remaining the same. So there's a false cause effect relationship between unit fixed cost and profitability. Those two things are in fact contingent. Then you were asked which scenario would you choose. Many among you chose the scenario 1, which is the least damaging in terms of profitability, because the decrease in profitability is only -16 as opposed to -80% or -64. Whatever the scenario, the profitability would remain positive because it decreases by less than 100% and it is positive in the beginning. Nevertheless, I agree that the scenario 1, which consists in refusing the price war and accepting a decrease in volume, is the least damaging. However, if your strategy is to increase sales and to increase possibly market share at the expense of profitability, then you could choose scenario 3.